given their exam schedule, which is very happy to be invited here. He's here. He's a professor of political science at the St. Louis University in Brussels. He's also has been for quite a long time associated with the Hoover Institute in the University of Louvain, and still involved with them. He's also the chair of BN, the Basic Income Earth Network, their regional coordination committee. He chairs that. And he's also the co-editor of a very good book that was published only in 2013, which is called Basic Income, an Anthology of Contemporary Research, which tries to pull together much of the main research on basic income from around the world. And he's one of the lead editors on that. And he's written very extensively on basic income in a variety of different publications and books that have been edited by other people, including Bridget Reynolds and myself, over the years. And one of the things I was saying to him was when I looked him up on Facebook, as one does these days, so you can search, and sorry, on Facebook, put in a search and Google and what comes in. One of the very first things that comes out there is a photograph of him making a presentation to the European Parliament in February of this year on basic income. So I don't think we could get a more capable person to talk to us about the topic that we asked him to talk about, which is transnational cooperation in the campaign for basic income and on recent developments on the theory and politics of basic income. So I hand you over to you.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you, Sean, for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here. It's not my first time in Dublin. My first time in Dublin was in 2000, so I was, Sean say, I'm in the new wave, but I'm already involved in the basic income discussion since 10 to 15 years. And in 2000, I was doing my PhD research. I was starting my PhD research on the political feasibility of basic income. And so I visited some Irish basic income advocates here in Dublin, including Sean, including Paul O'Brien, who's here today, including John Baker. And it's interesting because at the time I considered Ireland to be one of the European countries where basic income was probably the most politically feasible. There was kind of an optimism here in Dublin about the feasibility of basic income. I saw similar optimism in the Netherlands at the time. And now, of course, I have to say that 40 years later, the situation looks a bit different, not only here, but also in the other countries I studied at the time. And before I introduce my talk, there is, I think, one striking feature here when you compare the two periods, and you can express that under the form of a kind of a paradox. It seems that in times of economic growth, basic income sounds more feasible because we have the means to fund it, we have the means to finance it. And at the time, I remember that Irish simulations were quite clear in that respect. So there was cautious optimism. But at the same time, I also remember that many people were telling us, well, why bother? I mean, we have jobs, we create jobs, we have growth, so why would we need a basic income? And then in times of economic recession, we badly need an income guarantee like the basic income. We need it because of rising inequalities and rising poverty. But many people then will tell you that we lack the means to fund it and we don't have the money to pay for it. So, leaving that aside, and we can of course come back to that issue in the discussion, what I'd like to do today, what I was asked to do actually, was to talk about developments in the basic income discussion, that is developments in the theory of basic income and the politics of basic income, and we'll talk also about the transnational cooperation. Of course, this is very ambitious, and in order to organize the discussion a little, I decided to divide the discussion into two sections. I will first talk about the theory of basic income, and I will be highly selective here. I'm not going to tell you about, for instance, there is a whole discussion, still very interesting, still very stimulating, about basic income and women, the impact of basic income on the situation of women. I'm not going to deal with that here, but we can of course come back to that in the discussion. I will here only deal with 3 features of the theoretical definition of basic income. Of course, these features have an impact on the practical discussion. They have an impact on the politics of basic income. And then second, I will talk more about the politics of basic income. And here, I'll try to take examples from Europe and a little bit from outside Europe. I have been working recently on the case of Japan, and I'd like to say you a few words about this. Once again, this will be a selective overview, right? In both cases, I have to be selective, and I would be happy to discuss further some of these issues with you. Right, so let me start then with the theory of basic income. And when I discussed about this conference about this day, this summer forum, by the way, this summer is quite cold in Dublin. John Baker told me you should try to focus on some of the new developments. Of course, nothing here is really new. But if I decided to focus on these 3 aspects that you will see, it's partly because I think that these problems, these features of the debate remain open for discussion. And that we still have many things to improve probably in our arguments for basic income. Let me first tackle the first issue, which is still very much present in the theoretical debate. It's the migration challenge. It's very clear, I think, that the question of the impact of basic income on migration remains quite very much on the agenda, perhaps even more today than before. Probably also because, as we see many European countries, that was the case in my country recently, in France, in the UK, you have the rise of many extreme right parties, and so that migration issue is a big issue. And I notice when I talk about basic income with the general public, with students, etc., many people will ask me, what would happen if one single country, say Ireland or Belgium, implement a basic income? Do we have to expect a massive migration from other countries? Can we really implement that on our own? So basic income would function as a kind of welfare magnet, right? And so this is, of course, of key importance within the European Union, especially as European regulation requires that all social benefits are accessible to EU residents. Of course, we cannot prohibit people from other EU countries to access, for instance, the minimum income. So that would be the same with the basic income. This is of key importance within the European Union, but this is also of key importance within the framework of any reflection about global justice, as there is a clear tension here between the requirement of solidarity towards the least well-off within our societies and our countries, and the same requirement of solidarity towards the global poor. So when you look at the basic income literature, say the theoretical literature, you see that this is an issue which is discussed. For instance, I took one example. You have this paper which was published in June 2012 in Basic Income Studies about the challenge of migration. They have a very optimistic conclusion. They say that basic income will not cause massive migration. Migrants are not really motivated by those kind of benefits. What they want is to get a job. I'm not totally convinced by their conclusions, but I would say, to sum up, that in the basic income debate about this question, you see at least two kind of positions in the debate. The first position consists in saying, for some basic income advocates, that you should implement restriction in the access to this benefit. So that they argue that we can impose some residence requirements so that people should first stay for, say, 2 or 3 years in the country before they get access to the basic income. So you have that, people arguing in favor of that. That's possible for migrants from outside of the EU, but again, inside the EU, it makes no sense to defend such a position because it's totally illegal and it's not compatible with EU regulation. Of course, you could say we could change EU regulation, but it's quite difficult. And the case law of the European Court of Justice on this is very clear. These benefits should be open to all EU residents. So on the other hand, and that's more interesting, I think, this issue, the migration challenge, has triggered a new reflection in Europe about supranational forms of basic income. Not only in Europe, so for instance, one colleague, Michael Howard, some of you know him, have been proposing such a supranational basic income at the level of North America. He called it the NAFTA dividend, so Mexico, Canada, and the US. But of course, the most interesting discussion has taken place at the level of the European Union. This discussion, again, is not entirely new, but it has really grown intense in the last few years. And we devoted a whole session about this at the last Vienna Congress, latest Vienna Conference in 2012, around the proposal made by Philippe Van Parijs. So his proposal is called the Euro dividend. And the Euro dividend, to sum up very briefly, you can probably read it there at the bottom, is, but it's really for illustrative purposes, a monthly Euro dividend of 200 euros paid to all EU residents, funded by 20% EU-wide value-added tax. Okay, that's the proposal he made, and of course, open for discussion. And that's one way to, say, tackle the migration challenge, is to implement such a scheme, such a basic income scheme, at European level. Of course, the migration challenge remains at the border of the European Union. So it's only a partial solution. I must stress also the fact that this discussion is not only related to the migration challenge itself, but of course it's also related to the crisis, to the economic crisis, and especially to the crisis within the Eurozone, and the necessary solidarity between, interpersonal solidarity between the citizens of the European Union. And here, people like Philippe Van Parijs have been insisting a lot on the contrast with the US, the monetary union called the United States of America, where you have interpersonal transfers which are funded at the level of the federal state. And these transfers, under the form of medical care, social benefits, etc., help to offset economic shocks and trends in the various member states. And we don't have that in Europe. We don't have such interpersonal solidarity. Of course, the argument here is that we cannot hope for a mega, super European welfare state, but what we can do is having a modest income floor, income guarantee under the form of a Euro dividend, which would play a role of interpersonal solidarity, and then on top of this dividend, welfare states could still build their own programs. So I will come back then, of course, in the politics about this supranational question in my second section. First challenge, the migration challenge. A second challenge, which is once again not new, but which is still, I think, open for discussion and very important for us basic income advocates to be able to tackle, that's the human capital challenge. And it's a challenge which keeps really puzzling me, and I think we have to reflect about that, and we have to be ready to reply to objections related to that human capital challenge. This relates to, for instance, this was a very good article, it's only in Dutch, by Bovenberg and Van der Ploeg. These were two Dutch economists, and they published a paper in '95 which was arguing against basic income. This is an excerpt from the Volkskrant, is one of the main newspapers in the Netherlands, and this newspaper referred to that study. Economen verwerpen idee van basisinkomen means economists reject the idea of a basic income. Basic income was very much on the agenda at the time in the Netherlands. And why did they reject the idea? Well, precisely because they say it will generate a waste in human capital. Basically, in their view, what they argued is that if young people know that they will benefit from a basic income at the age of 18 or at the age of 21, they said, they will have no financial incentives to study. They will have no incentives to improve their skills and education. They will opt for undemanding activities, low productivity jobs. They will not invest additional time in schooling. And I quote again, these developments due to the basic income threaten the most important capital good in a knowledge-intensive society, the human capital and the work discipline of future generations. Okay, so I'm not saying that I agree with them, not at all, but I think it's an important challenge because, of course, it's even more clear now, 20 years later, we are in a knowledge-intensive society, and human capital is of paramount importance. And so I believe that basic income supporters have to reply to that challenge. One reply could, of course, consist in saying, well, you know, the important thing about basic income is just that it gives real freedom to everyone, including the young. If they want to be lazy and to opt for undemanding activities, why not? What's the problem? So that's the real libertarian argument. I think on theoretical grounds it makes sense. I even find that argument attractive. Real freedom for all would say people like Philippe Van Parijs. But of course, when you discuss with the general public about basic income, it's not very convincing to say that people have the right to be lazy. You need to find something else. And I think in that respect, that there is at least one good argument, and there might be many others, I'm sure there are, and we might discuss that later on. I think that if they're wrong, it's precisely, Bodenberg and Van der Broek are wrong, it's precisely because they tend to forget that basic income could precisely be used by younger generations to subsidize their training, their schooling, their studies. And I don't know about Ireland, I'm pretty sure it's the same than in my country, in Belgium, or in France, or in the Netherlands. What we observe today in our studies is that an increasing number of young people, skilled or unskilled, will only access the labor market after a period of vocational training. Vocational training has become of paramount importance, and potential employers increasingly expect them to have some work experience. And the problem is that very often such training, such vocational training, is, of course, unpaid. It's very often unpaid. Of course, we could say it should be paid, but the fact is that it's very often unpaid today. And this gives a privilege to those who can benefit from the help of their families, often their parents. And it's detrimental to those who cannot afford such a period of unpaid vocational training. And this is the reason precisely why I think that basic income is needed to improve, in order to improve human capital, even in the narrow sense, because it can be used as a subsidy for vocational training. I say it's human capital in the very narrow sense because, in fact, I strongly believe, of course, that one of the big advantages of basic income is that it helps to improve human capital in a very broad sense, not only on the labor market, but in various forms of activities. But if you want to focus on labor market, as these economists do, and as the general public very often do, we here have an argument which is related to basic income as a subsidy for vocational training. It's a very strategic or instrumental view of basic income that I think is important. And then to finish this first section, there is the moral challenge. It's still very much there in the discussion today. You could say that there are many moral challenges to basic income, but there is at least one which is the moral objection, And that's, of course, the reciprocity objection, the idea that every time you talk about basic income to people who might be interested in social policy, redistribution, and so on, they will very often reply by saying, you know, how can you justify that? People need to work, people need to be active. You cannot give an income without any work requirement. So there might perhaps be something like a right to work and so on, but there should also, for sure, be a duty to work. Now, once again, this discussion is not new. Most of you know that discussion. But recently, there was an intense debate within the basic income community with advocates of an alternative to basic income, which is the job guarantee. We had the whole debate last year in Brussels with the most prominent advocate of a job guarantee, Philip Harvey, who's a professor in the US, and is really very much in favor of job guarantees and very much against basic income. He came to Brussels to defend his proposal of a job guarantee and to attack basic income. So the challenge is still very much there. Basically, what Harvey says is that the only way to guarantee a right to work, a right to a job, is to have a job guarantee, which is actually a direct job creation by the state. Okay? Instead of offering people income security and income guarantee, public authorities should create jobs on a massive scale. Okay? So there would be what he calls a publicly funded direct job creation program. And of course, people would be obliged, required to take these jobs if they're able to. Okay? If you're unable to work, you can get an income from the state. But if you're able to work and you can't find a job on the normal labor market, then you will get a job from this public program. Okay, many objections can be made to that scheme, but at least it forces us once again to think about the importance of work, the importance of labor. And basically, I think, to be fair enough to Phil Harvey, it's not basically that he says that work as such is intrinsically important. What is important here is that work is an instrument that guarantees access to other, John Rawls would say, social primary goods, that is, especially self-esteem, social recognition, etc., social contact, and so on. So work is not important as such, but as an instrument to achieve other goals: social recognition, social capital, social esteem, and self-esteem. And I think that to some extent in the basic income discussion, some basic income advocates have tended to underestimate the importance of work. At least in the French discussion, which I know best because I'm French speaking, in the French discussion, the French-speaking discussion, many people still defend basic income as an alternative to employment, as an alternative to full employment. I'm basically not against that, but for many of us, work remains quite important, the labor market remains quite important, access to employment remains the best way to access this social recognition and self-esteem, and that's precisely what Phil Harvey and his colleagues insist on. So probably we should not dismiss totally the idea of job creation by the states, and I'm personally not against public jobs, etc. But at the same time, I think that basic income remains a better tool to achieve job creation for various reasons, and let me just mention two of them. First, I think that a job guarantee program a la Phil Harvey, of course, will, like any kind of workfare program, will tend to force individuals into the labor market, and basic income advocates very often stress the fact that forcing people into the labor market might actually prove counterproductive. Okay, when you're forced to take a job, For obvious reasons, the average productivity of your labor will be quite low. By contrast, the cost of such a program is very high, probably much higher than the cost of a modest basic income. So the first reason is that forced labor is unproductive, and actually that's one of the reasons why we have, in my country, even some entrepreneurs who are against workwear programs. Because they say, you know, one of the most prominent of them is actually in favor of basic income. Because he says, you know, I don't want to have these people who do not want to work in my factory. I don't want to have them. Don't force them to come to my factory. I don't need them. It's better to give them an income guarantee and to help them to access the activities that they really want to do. And that's the second point about the basic income discussion that I think we should keep stressing all the time, is that we can see basic income as part of the activation strategy, helping people to access the labor market. Because, of course, and people like Sean know this very well, a basic income guarantee will help people to get access to jobs because it guarantees that even a poorly paid job can provide people with a higher net income than when they are inactive. So it's a job subsidy. Basic income can be used as a job subsidy. But it's very different from subsidies we have today because it's your own subsidy, you own it. So you have the power with the basic income to refuse jobs that you yourself will consider as being unpromising or unattractive or uninteresting. It's not people like Phil Harvey or the public servants who will tell you that you have to take that job, but you can use your subsidy to take the jobs that you really want to do. And that's something that we should still keep stressing, and that's probably the most important advantage of basic income compared to job guarantees programs. It gives people the free choice to use their subsidy where they want to use it. Now, let me then turn to, oh, I have that, okay. Let me then turn to the second section. I had planned to talk for about 40 minutes, so I took 20 now. I'll try to do 20 for this one, and then we will conclude. So here, I'll be much more concrete. So in the first section, I only took 3 challenges, and we can discuss many others. I'm open, of course, to discussing other challenges. Here, once again, I'll be very selective. I'll try to give you some insights about the basic income discussion, what happened recently in Europe, and a little bit outside of Europe. And I'll say a bit more also about BIEN, the Basic Income Earth Network. At BIEN, at the Basic Income Earth Network, we receive news about basic income around the world every day. Now, the debate is really going more and more intense since, I would say, 2010, 2011. Probably, of course, due to the economic crisis. Inside Europe, what I will do here is just, of course, insist in particular on citizens' initiatives. Why? Because it's a totally new feature in the discussion, in the debate, in politics, and basic income, especially because to some extent you have the feeling that it was organizing without organization. So really, grassroots movements managed to attract media attention and political attention on basic income. Many of you have heard of this first initiative. It's at European level. So for those of you who do not know this concept of the ECI, European Citizens Initiative, it was introduced by the Lisbon Treaty in 2007. The possibility for citizens, so it's called, I think it's called in English, agenda setting initiative. So it means that citizens can try to put an item on the agenda of the EU Commission and the EU Parliament. It doesn't mean that the Commission has to take action, but at least they have to consider the item and to discuss it, right? 2007 Lisbon Treaty, but it was only operational in 2012, so very late, there were many problems. And the idea is that 7 citizens from 7 different member states can submit a proposal to the Commission for an initiative, and if this proposal is accepted, you have to meet some requirements. Of course, it has to be within the realm of the competencies of the European Union, of course. You cannot, for instance, submit a proposal, I don't know, racist proposal. That's not accepted. Once your proposal is accepted, you have 12 months to collect 1 million signatures across Europe. 1 million signatures, actually it's not so much, but you have to collect them in at least 7 different member states with a minimum threshold for all member states. Right, so this initiative was accepted by the Commission in January 2013. So they had then 12 months until January 2014 to collect the million signatures, and the proposal, the official text of the initiative, you have it here, basically was asking the Commission to encourage cooperation between the member states, aiming to explore the unconditional basic income as a tool to improve their respective social security system. Important thing here is to note that we're not really talking here about the European basic income, but rather the idea of promoting basic income within the different social security systems. And this is, of course, because the European Union, theoretically at least, has no competences to implement that at European level at this stage. The organizers managed to get almost 300,000 signatures, including here in Ireland, of course. But what's interesting is that they managed to do that. 300,000 is not that bad, it's not very high, but they managed to do that without the support of any big organization. Whereas some other initiatives managed to get to the million signatures, but very often it was because they got the support of big trade unions, for instance, big organizations from the civil society. Bien, for instance, Bien, Basic Income Earth Network, gave €1,000 to the initiative, and I think that in total, the ECI on basic income managed to collect €3,000, so it's very small. It was all based on voluntary work. Second example, I took it in French, that's Switzerland. Switzerland, of course, has a long experience in citizens' initiatives. Here, it's an initiative which is different. It's not an agenda-setting initiative, which is the case of the European initiative. It's an initiative to change the Swiss constitution. So, if the Swiss vote in favor of this initiative, the constitution of the federal Switzerland, the federal constitution would be changed. And in Switzerland, in order to get to that, you first have to collect 100,000 signatures over 18 months. So 100,000 signatures over 18 months. It's a lot because if you take the voting age population in Switzerland, you have approximately 6 million. So you need to collect 100,000 signatures from Swiss citizens during 18 months, and you have 6 million potential people who can sign. And if you can collect the signatures, then there will be a referendum within 2 or 3 years on the initiative. Okay? So the Swiss initiative was launched in April 2012, and the proposal was to add the following article to the Swiss constitution. The Confederation introduces an unconditional basic income. The basic income must enable the whole population to live a dignified life and to participate in public life. And third, the law will determine the funding and level of basic income, right? So as you see here, in French, revenu de base inconditionnel means unconditional basic income. Actually, they managed to collect much more signatures in the German part than in the French part. Probably the influence of the German debate. German debate is very intense. Explains that partly. And in October 2013, so 18 months after the initiative was launched, they managed to hand over 127,000 signatures to the federal government in Bern. So they managed to collect enough signatures to trigger a process that should lead to a federal referendum on basic income in 2016. And it's of course a very, very impressive result, and we'll have to follow that closely. I'll be back on the Swiss case in a moment. Another example, Finland. Finland also had an initiative on basic income. I'll be very brief on that. Finland, since recently, can also have this initiative. It's also like the European one, an agenda setting initiative. So there in Finland, they have to collect 50,000 signatures in 6 months. 50,000 signatures in 6 months, and then the item will be put on the agenda of the Finnish Parliament. And in 2013, Bien Finland, so Basic Income Earth Network Finland, managed to collect 22,000 signatures. Not enough, but it had an impact. I'll be back on this in a second. So, last example, so I took the example of the European Citizens Initiative, the Swiss initiative, the Finnish initiative. That's something a bit different, but I also want to stress that the Council of Europe is not the European Union, even if they very often cooperate with the European Union. It's another institution, you know, it's based in Strasbourg, in France. And the Council of Europe organized a huge conference on poverty and inequality in February 2013. And I just want to stress the fact it's very illustrative. Basic income was very prominent in that conference, and basic income was taken up in the conclusions and the official report of this conference. So it's not that basic income is considered as being a bit of a marginal, crazy idea. There, and in many other cases I just mentioned, it was at the core of the discussion about the future of social rights in Europe. Now, to finish on this first point about Europe, I cannot deal with all the other developments, but here I decided to focus on these issues, especially on the citizens' initiatives, because I think that we have at least two important things to learn from that. The first is, of course, that you could say, well, this citizens' initiative, perhaps they don't make much sense because two of them failed, the Finnish one, the European one. The Swiss, they succeeded to collect the signatures, but it's highly implausible that they will manage to win the referendum. I'm very sure they will not. So you can say, what's the point? Well, the point is, of course, that these initiatives, and especially the Swiss one, managed to attract a lot of political and media attention. In the European Citizen Initiatives case, it's very, very clear. We received many demands, many journalists wanted to interview the initiators. It was taken up in electoral platforms, it was discussed in public debates, it will probably perhaps generate a new basic income European movement. So it had an impact. It had an impact, even if they did not manage to collect the signatures. In Finland, we saw the same happening. Basic income was very prominent in the media. Artists, politicians, trade union leaders, etc., expressed their support or discussed basic income. So it was there in the public debate. And in Switzerland, of course, it attracted a lot of attention, including in the New York Times. And here, of course, The Swiss had a long experience in organizing referendums or initiatives. And they know how to attract media attention, they know how to collect signatures, and they know how to create some events around the proposal. That was especially the case when they handled the signatures in Bern at the federal parliament, because they came with a truck full of coins when they handled over the signatures, and the media, televisions and so on, came of course to film that and to interview the people, the initiators, and it had a huge impact. Everyone now in Switzerland knows about basic income. So even if they fail with the referendum, at least you could say that it's very different from a marginal discussion of basic income in academic circles. It's now a public discussion. And the second important thing, so first important thing is these initiatives help to attract media attention, political attention. The second important thing is that it says a lot, I think, about new ways to put a proposal on the agenda. Here, basic income was really supported by self-organized citizens, not by trade unions, not by political parties. And of course, these groups relied massively on new strategies, on web activism, Facebook, Twitter, and so on. So it creates new avenues and new opportunities to defend basic income. Then outside of Europe, well, many things happened outside of Europe, and I really don't see how I could give you an overview. For instance, I just mentioned it to Sean at lunchtime. One of our friends, François Blais, who is one of the main advocates of basic income in Canada, in French Canada and in Quebec, just became Minister of Employment and Social Solidarity in the new Quebec government. And so once again, it creates interest in basic income, because journalists want to know if he's going to implement the basic income in Quebec. He's not. It's austerity in Quebec, but it creates once again debate and discussion. So instead of trying to give you an overview of everything that could be said about outside of Europe, I decided to focus briefly, before I conclude, on Japan, because I've been involved in the discussion in Japan recently, and we are preparing a book which will be published in October this year about basic income in Japan at Palgrave. And it's a very interesting discussion, quite recent. Basic Income Japan, there is a network in Japan. It was founded in 2007, and since then they managed to attract media attention. They managed to put basic income on the agenda of some political parties. And very often the discussion in Japan is focused on this article of the Japanese Constitution, the rights to subsistence. All people shall have the right to maintain the minimum standards of wholesome and cultural living. So very often basic income advocates in Japan start from this article of the Constitution to argue in favor of basic income. Right. What are the interesting features of the Japanese debate? And perhaps there are some similarities with what we see here. I just take a few of them, a few of these features. First, we see different versions of basic income, and that might be a danger. One of the versions that is prominent in the Japanese debate is a very neoliberal vision of basic income. It's defended especially by this figure, Toru Hashimoto. Is a very popular, very famous figure in Japan. He was the mayor of Osaka. He launched a party called the first Osaka Ishinokai, means Osaka Restoration Party, and now he also has a national party, which is Japan Restoration Party. And you see, reform the social security system, introduce a negative income tax and basic income concept. But there, his idea is, of course, to suppress most social programs and to replace them by a modest negative income tax. Second interesting feature, the work ethic in Japan is very strong. That could sound as kind of a stereotype, but it's true. I mean, the work ethic is very strong, And so it's very difficult to defend basic income in such a context. So you really have a clash there between basic income supporters and defenders of the traditional work ethic. And these people then often refer to another article of the Japanese Constitution, Article 27, all people shall have the right and the obligation to work. So they say, well, you're right on 25, look at this, duty to work. Third interesting feature of the Japanese debate, and that's pretty similar to what we see in Europe. The Japanese social protection system has traditionally been very well connected with the big corporations. So many people receive social benefits through their jobs in big corporations, child benefits, housing, and so on. But this is not collapsing, but this is really eroding. And now Japan has seen a massive increase in casual work, part-time employment, people who are, you could say, precarious work. So these people have a very low level of social protection. And it's becoming a huge problem. And of course, basic income advocates in Japan argue precisely in favor of basic income because of this new development. Estimates say that approximately 30% of the Japanese workforce is very precarious. And then finally, let me just mention one interesting feature, again, of the Japanese debate is the situation of women. Traditionally in Japan, women have been very dependent on their husbands, and that's the reason why many Japanese feminists argue also in favor of basic income to give some economic independence to women. Let me then finish, I forgot that this will be very brief and then I'll conclude, about the international level. Bien, basic income of network. Bien has grown in recent years. We have had new affiliates from various countries. I just mentioned Japan, but there is a French network which has just been launched, the Belgian network, Finland, Slovenia, another member state of the European Union. Slovenia has a very active network, basic income network. They even think of organizing a Bien conference in the future. It's the case in Finland too. So it has grown, but at the same time, my feeling is that Bien has really come to a kind of turning point. It seems to me when I talk with activists, perhaps with people from what Sean would call the new wave, many people feel that Bien has become an old-fashioned organization. And basically, if you look at the executive committee of Bien, so that's the next Congress in Montreal in the end of June. Well, what do you see? Actually, what we managed to achieve is a gender balance, that's fine, but we're almost all academics, with the exception of Kelly. Kelly Ernst is actually the conference organizer, so he's not a voting member in the executive committee, and with the exception of Claudio Yanes, who is not at the university anymore, but who was an academic. So it's full of academics. It's full of academics, and I think that's really a picture of old Bien. Old Bien, that is a network of academics who were publishing about basic income, organizing conferences to discuss papers, exchange arguments. It remains important in the sense that, of course, having academics in such a network will probably, I hope, increase the legitimacy of the proposal. But of course, it's not enough today. You need to have fresh blood, people who are able to do more of what I call web activism, using social networks. Also people who are able to use, and that's a huge challenge for us, different languages. We're used to function in English, but we receive news from everywhere. And we need people able to interact in French, German, Spanish, etc. So I really believe, and I'd like to have your input on this, that Bien will need to find a compromise between the old-fashioned academics which are, I hope, still important, and the Fresh Blood web activists were able to turn Vienna into a more active and more proactive organization. Let me just conclude by saying that what I really feel important in the basic income discussion is no fetishism. I'm in favor of basic income, of course, but I also think that we need to advocate basic income as a long-term objective, and that we don't have to be dismissive about gradual steps towards that objective. And so that basic income can inspire more modest reforms. So for instance, what I observed in Japan is that the basic income debate has forced some opponents to come with attractive alternatives, such as, for instance, tax credits. I know it's a topic here in Ireland too. Tax credits, especially under the form of refundable tax credits, are discussed now in Japan, and part of the reason is that there was this basic income discussion. And so I think that the tax credits are a good step towards this implementation of a true basic income. Other example, this basic income discussion could inspire more modest reforms in terms of training subsidies for the young, a young or a youth basic income. Why not? We could also argue in favor of what Klaus often called sabbatical accounts. So basic income forces us to have a more flexible look at work, at labor, and perhaps forces us to think about the idea of having periods in life where we can withdraw from the labor market, not necessarily, as you could do with a true basic income, forever, not opt out of the labor market forever, but at least for a short period of time. What we can do as academics, we can take a sabbatical leave. Everyone should be able to do that. Everyone should have such a sabbatical account to be able, from time to time, to get out of the labor market and to do something else. And finally, why not think about an EU-wide child benefit? Child poverty is very high in Europe, especially in some countries in the south. Why not think about a EU-wide child benefit? According to our estimates, so you have approximately 10% of the EU population is below the age of 10. If you took a 1% EU-wide value-added tax, 1%, it would make it possible to give every child below 10 a monthly child benefit of 100 euros. Okay, so if you increase the value-added tax, you can give 200. But at least, once again, this is a more modest form of basic income, but I think it would be a step in the right direction. Okay, so I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.